Greetings. This is Brother Eli with another episode of Bible Truth Revealed. Today, I will be exploring the scriptures, which are the quote-unquote Old Testament and the Apocrypha, to answer the question, is it a sin to have multiple wives? Is it a sin to have multiple wives? A careful search of the scriptures reveals that there is no law that prohibits a man from having multiple wives. So the answer to the question is no, it is not a sin to have multiple wives. In this teaching, I will also be answering the following questions. 1. How prevalent was the practice of having multiple wives in ancient Hebrew society? Number 2, what is a biblical pattern for having multiple wives in ancient Israel? 3, is every Israelite man required to have multiple wives? 4, how does a woman become your wife? Number 5, do we need a marriage certificate? Number 6, what security can wives have in the absence of a legally recognized marriage certificate? Number 7, if a man can't afford to provide for a second wife, but he desires to have another wife, what should he do? And number 8, if having multiple wives is not a sin, why do most Christians insist that it is? For a bit of background, let us go to the New World Encyclopedia. Under the heading Polygamy, it says human polygamy exists in 3 specific forms, including polygyny, which is one man having multiple wives, polyandry, one woman having multiple husbands, and group marriage, which is some combination of polygyny and polyandry. Historically, all 3 practices have been found, but polygyny is by far the most common. Under the heading Polygyny, the New World Encyclopedia states, polygyny is a marital practice in which a man has more than one wife simultaneously. That means the man has multiple wives all at the same time. Quote number 2 says, while polygyny has been a widespread historical occurrence, it has never been a majority experience or complete norm within any society. So it has always been practiced, but not everybody has been doing it. It has always been optional. It continues, it was accepted in ancient Hebrew society. By ancient Hebrew society, this includes the Israelites, in classical China, and in Islam. It has also been accepted in many traditional African and Polynesian cultures. In India, polygyny was practiced from ancient times onward, though historically, only kings were polygynous in practice. Let's have a closer look at the practice of polygyny in ancient Hebrew society. And for this, we'll turn to the scriptures. 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 18 to 23. That's 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 18 to 23. It says, and Rehoboam took to himself for a wife Mulath, daughter of Jeremoth the son of David, and Abigail, daughter of Eliab the son of Jesse, 19. And she bore him sons, Jeus and Samoria and Zaham, verse 20. And afterwards he took to himself Maacah, the daughter of Absalom. So he already has multiple wives. And she bore him Abiah, and Jethai, and Zesah, and Salamoth. Verse 21, and Rehoboam loved Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, more than all his wives and all his concubines, for he had 18 wives and 60 concubines. And he begot 28 sons and 60 daughters. Verse 22. And he made Abiah the son of Maacah chief, even a leader among his brethren, for he intended to make him king. Verse 23. And he was exalted beyond all his other sons in all the coasts of Judah and Benjamin, and in the strong cities, and he gave them provisions in great abundance, and he desired many wives. So Rehoboam had 18 wives and 60 concubines. That's 78 women in total. And his son Abiah desired many wives. That was a normal practice in ancient Israelite society. 2 Chronicles 13 verse 21, but Abiah, who's also called Abijah, strengthened himself and took to himself 14 wives. So he has satisfied his desire for many wives, and he begot 22 sons and 16 daughters. 1 Kings 27 verse 3 in the Septuagint is 1 Samuel 27 verse 3 in the KJV. 1 Kings chapter 27 verse 3 in the Septuagint is 1 Samuel chapter 27 verse 3 in the KJV, and it reads thus. And David dwelt with Anchus, he and his men, each with his family, and David and both his wives, Achinnam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. So we see David had 2 wives. 2 Kings chapter 5 verse 13 in the Septuagint is 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 13 in the KJV. That's 2 Kings chapter 5 verse 13 in the Septuagint, or 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 13 in the KJV. It says, and David took again wives and concubines out of Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and David had still more sons and daughters born to him. So 2 wives were not enough for David. He actually took more because it was normal practice in ancient Hebrew Israelite society. Judges chapter 8 verses 30 to 31. Judges chapter 8 verses 30 to 31 says, and Gideon had 70 sons begotten of his body, for he had many wives. Gideon had many wives, verse 31, and his concubine was in Shechem, and she also bore him a son, and gave him the name Abimelech. So Gideon not only had many wives, he had a concubine. 2 Chronicles chapter 24 verses 1 to 3. 2 Chronicles chapter 24 verses 1 to 3 reads thus. Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Sabiah of Bersabee. Verse 2. And Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jediah the priest. Verse 3. And Jediah, that's the priest, took to himself 2 wives, and they bore sons and daughters. So even the priests were taking multiple wives. 1 Kings chapter 1 verses 1 to 2. In the Septuagint is 1 Samuel chapter 1 verses 1 to 2 in the KJV. 1 Kings chapter 1 verses 1 to 2 in the Septuagint is 1 Samuel chapter 1 verses 1 to 2 in the KJV. It reads thus. There was a man of Amathaim Sepha, of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, a son of Jeremiel, the son of Elias, the son of Thok, in Nasib Ephraim. Verse 2, and he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Anna, and the name of the second, Phinana. And Phinana had children, but Anna had no child. So we've seen all these examples of men having multiple wives in ancient Hebrew Israelite society. If having multiple wives is a sin, it means that all these ancient Israelite men were living in sin. Yet the Most High never once condemned or corrected them. Would the Most High have remained silent on this issue if it were indeed a sin? Certainly not. From these passages, we can identify a biblical pattern for having multiple wives. it is this: desire plus affordability equals multiple wives. Desire plus affordability equals multiple wives. In ancient Israel, when a man desired to have multiple wives, he also provided for them because he could afford to provide for them. In the examples that we've examined so far, all the men were fully capable of providing for all their wives. David, Solomon, Rehoboam, also known as Rehoboam, and Abiah, also known as Abijah, were kings. These were rich men. And Gideon was a judge in Israel. He was a ruler. He was a rich man. So they could clearly afford to have multiple wives. They had the desire and they could afford it, so they had multiple wives. Jodiah, the priest, was a wealthy man. How do we know that? Because at this time, the priests were very well provided for. The people were paying the tithes so that the priests would lack nothing. So the priests could afford to have multiple wives. If it were a sin to have multiple wives, these priests could not be serving the Most High God. He would have destroyed them. Elkanah, who became the father of Prophet Samuel, could afford to have at least 2 wives. We have no good reason to believe that either of his wives lacked basic necessities such as food and shelter. The passage says that Anna had no child, but it makes no mention of Anna having no food and Anna having no shelter. Why? Because Anna was well provided for. Elkanah was a righteous man who provided for both of his wives. What if an Israelite man could afford to provide for multiple wives, but he did not desire multiple wives? Well, there has never been a law that said a man must have multiple wives. Having multiple wives is not a requirement for righteousness. There are some people who say it's the ideal to have multiple wives, and they push this ideal as though it were law, but it is not a law. It is not a requirement for righteousness. No one has to have multiple wives, even if that man is rich. Our forefather Isaac is an excellent example of a righteous man who could have afforded to have many wives, but chose to have only one. Let's look at Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24, I will read verse 15, verses 21 to 22, verses 34 to 36, and verse 53. Genesis chapter 24 speaks about finding a wife for Isaac. And in this passage, we are going to learn that Isaac was very rich. Verse 15. And it came to pass before he had done speaking his mind, this is Abraham's servant, that behold, Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nachor, and the brother of Abraham, came forth, having a water pot on her shoulders. Verse 21. And the man took great notice of her, and remained silent to know whether the Lord had made his way prosperous or not, because the servant of Abraham was sent to find a wife for Isaac. And he prayed that the Most High would provide this wife, and even before he had finished praying, Rebekah appeared. So he wants to know, has the Most High already answered my prayer? Verse 22. And it came to pass when all the camels ceased drinking, that the man took golden earrings, each of a drachm weight, and he put 2 bracelets on her hands. Their weight was 10 pieces of gold. So right away we see that he's giving gifts to this woman because Isaac was a wealthy man. Verse 34. And he said, I am a servant of Abraham. Verse 35. And the Lord has blessed my master greatly. That's wealth. And he is exalted. And he has given him sheep and calves and silver and gold, servants and servant maids, camels and asses. Verse 36. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore one son to my master after he had grown old. And it continues, and he gave him whatever he had, meaning that all the riches that Abraham had were given to his son, Isaac. Isaac was a wealthy man. Verse 53, and the servant, having brought forth jewels of silver and gold and raiment, gave them to Rebekah, and gave gifts to her brother and to her mother. So to reiterate, desire plus affordability equals multiple wives is a biblical pattern for the practice of polygyny in ancient Hebrew Israelite society. It is not a law or a requirement for righteousness. If it were, Isaac would have had multiple wives, but he had no desire for multiple wives. What about our forefathers Abraham and Jacob, who each desired only one wife, but whose circumstances resulted in them having multiple wives? Were they living in sin? Because if having multiple wives is a sin, then Abraham and Jacob were indeed living in sin. Let us examine the scriptures. Genesis chapter 16 verses 1 to 3. Genesis chapter 16 verses 1 to 3 reads thus. And Sarah, the wife of Abraham, bore him no children. And she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. Verse 2. And Sarah said to Abraham, Behold, the Lord has restrained me from bearing. Go therefore into my maid, that I may get children for myself through her. And Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarah. Verse 3. So Sarah, the wife of Abraham, having taken Hagar the Egyptian her handmaid, after Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, gave her to Abraham her husband as a wife to him. So now Abraham, he hearkened, he listened to his wife, he went into the handmaid, and he took her as a second wife. Now, he was very rich. This meant that he could have afforded to have multiple wives if he wanted to. But he did not have that desire. His wife was the one who convinced him to take Hagar as his wife. And he did. If doing so was a sin, he would have refused to take a second wife. But he did not refuse. There are righteous women today who know that their husbands can afford to provide for a second wife, and they encourage their husbands to take an additional wife, even though the man himself did not initially have the desire for an additional wife. If the husband hearkens or listens to his wife and takes a second wife, that is not a sin. It is not a sin. If it were a sin, it would be written in the scriptures that thou should not take an additional wife. In Genesis chapter 29, we read that Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah when the agreement was for him to marry Rachel. However, if he had put away Leah after discovering that he was tricked and deceived, Laban would have never given him Rachel to wife. So he found himself in a difficult situation. Let's read Genesis 29 verses 25 to 28. Genesis chapter 29 verses 25 to 28 reads thus. And it was morning, and behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, What is this that thou hast done to me? Did I not serve thee for Rachel? And wherefore hast thou deceived me? In other words, why did you trick me, Laban? Verse 26, and Laban answered, It is not done thus in our country to give the younger before the elder. Verse 27, Fulfill then her sevens, and I will give thee her also in return for thy labor, which thou laborest with me, yet 7 other years. Verse 28, and Jacob did so, and fulfilled her sevens, and Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to wife. Now, Jacob knew that he was within his rights to have multiple wives, and that it would not be a sin to marry Rachel in addition to Leah. Therefore, he worked another 7 years so that he could marry Rachel as well. Jacob was later persuaded by Rachel and Leah, his 2 wives, to take even more wives. If that were a sin, Jacob, being a righteous man, would have refused. Genesis chapter 30, verse 18. Genesis chapter 30, verse 18. And Leah said, God has given me my reward. So God has rewarded Leah for something. Let's see what it is. Because I gave my maid to my husband. And she called his name Issachar, which is reward. So the Most High rewarded Leah because she gave Jacob an additional wife. The Most High does not reward sin. This confirms that it was not a sin for our righteous forefathers to have multiple wives. In fact, Jacob got 12 sons by his 4 wives, and these are the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. All praises to the Most High. Now that we know that it is not a sin to have multiple wives, the question is, how does a woman become your wife? There are 2 requirements for a woman to become a man's wife. 1, he must get her father's blessing or permission, and 2, he must have sexual intercourse with her. This is referred to in the scriptures as taking her or going in unto her. So if a man gets the father's permission or blessing, and he consummates by having sexual intercourse with the woman is now his wife. That's it. Genesis chapter 24 verse 67. Genesis chapter 24 verse 67 tells us what happened after Rebekah was chosen for Isaac. The father had already given permission and sent Rebekah with Abraham's servant. The verse says this, and Isaac went into the house of his mother and took Rebekah. That's sexual intercourse. He took her and she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted for Sarah, his mother. So he got the father's permission and he took her. Therefore, she was his wife. Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 to 17. Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 to 17 says this. And if anyone deceive, which means tricks, a virgin that is not betrothed, and that means she's not engaged or promised to be married to another man, and lie with her, that is, have sexual intercourse with her, he shall surely endow her for a wife to himself. Verse 17. And if her father positively refuse and will not consent to give her to him for a wife, he shall pay compensation to her father according to the amount of the dowry of virgins. So in this case, the man has tricked or deceived the woman into sleeping with him. And the law is he has to go and ask the father's permission to make her his wife. Why? Because both parts are required. In fact, the proper way is to ask the father's permission first. But this guy didn't do that. Instead, he deceived or tricked the virgin into sleeping with him. But he still had to go and do part 2 to make her his wife. And we see that the father can refuse to give this woman as a man's wife. In that case, that is not his wife. He has to pay a compensation, and the woman remains with her father. Someone might ask the question, but what about the marriage certificate? Let's look at Tobit chapter 7, verses 13 to 16. This is Tobit in the Apocrypha, chapter 7, verses 13 to 16. It says, Then he called his daughter Sarah, and she came to her father. And he took her by the hand and gave her to be wife to Tobias, saying, Behold, take her after the law of Moses, and lead her away to thy father. And he blessed them, verse 14, and called Edna his wife, and took paper, and did write an instrument of covenant, and sealed it. Verse 15, then they began to eat. So this man is giving away his daughter to Tobias to be Tobias's wife. And what he's done, he's taken paper and he has written an instrument of covenant, or as we say, the marriage certificate, and he sealed it. He put his signature on it. It's official. Verse 16, after Raguel called his wife Edna and said unto her, Sister, prepare another chamber and bring her in thither. What was the purpose of the chamber? It was to consummate their marriage. So we have all three parts. Father's permission, we have the marriage certificate, which the father prepared, and we have the consummation of the marriage. Our forefathers did not go to the oppressor to seek permission to marry. They simply went to the woman's father and got his permission. The instrument of covenant written by the father is the only marriage certificate that we need as Israelites. Now, it should be well known that that marriage certificate would not stand up in the court of law. So what security can wives have in the absence of a legally recognized marriage certificate? A righteous man could and probably would arrange for his wife to have private health cover to make sure that she is looked after in the case of any accident or illness. He would include her in his life insurance policy to make sure that in the event of his passing, she is provided for, and of course in his last will and testament. None of these require the permission of our oppressor, and they do stand up in court. What if a man can't afford to provide for a second wife, but he desires to have a second wife? What should he do? Because the biblical pattern is desire plus affordability equals multiple wives. What should a man do if he cannot afford another wife, but he desires to have another wife? The prophet Isaiah said that in the last days, many women would want a husband, but due to our condition in captivity, where many of our men are shot dead by the police, many are put in prison for crimes they did not commit, many are homosexual, and many are running after the other nations while neglecting the daughters of Zion. Most women would not be able to have a righteous Israelite husband, and most men would not be able to provide for multiple wives. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 1. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 1 says this, And 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, We will eat our own bread and wear our own raiment. Only let thy name be called upon us, and take away our reproach. 7 women, that's multiple wives, shall take hold of one man, saying, We will eat our own bread, we'll provide for ourselves, and wear our own raiment. Don't worry about the cost. Only let thy name be called upon us. Marry us, be our husband, and take away our reproach. Now, why would they say we will eat our own bread and wear our own raiment? Because the historical practice was for the man to provide for the woman. But we're living in a time when that is difficult, yet there are many daughters of Zion who have no husband. They desire a righteous husband, but there are not enough men for the women that are seeking a husband. Therefore, the prophecy says that 7 women, multiple wives, will take hold of one man, a single husband, and will provide for themselves, so that the reproach could be taken away from them. Just to be perfectly clear, when the scripture says, we will eat our own bread and wear our own raiment, these women are saying, we are going to provide for ourselves. You don't have to worry about whether you could afford to provide for us, because we are going to provide for ourselves. But in saying ourselves, that does not include the man. It is not the woman's responsibility to provide for the man. So those Israelites that are twisting this scripture and convincing these multiple wives that the man should sit at home while the women go out and work, they are being unrighteous. This scripture is not justification for taking advantage of our women. These women were already under reproach. The last thing they want is for an unrighteous Israelite man to let them be called by his name so that they could provide for him. If the man is able to provide for the woman, he should. If the man is unable to provide financially for these wives, and the wives are willing to provide for themselves, he should not increase their burden by expecting them to provide for him as well. This scripture does not allow for that. If he can't even provide for himself, he shouldn't even be thinking about having one wife, let alone multiple wives. So what is a reproach? In the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition of reproach is a cause of shame. A cause of shame. The synonyms that are given in the same dictionary for the word reproach are disgrace and dishonor. Why? Because it is a shame, a disgrace, and a dishonor that all people are so destroyed that our women have to go without righteous husbands. That is a disgrace. It is a dishonor. It is a shame. It is a reproach. So to take away that reproach, to fix the problem so that our righteous women can have righteous husbands, the solution is that 7 women will take hold of one man. The practice of polygyny is not a sin. It is a legitimate option if these women are willing and able to provide for themselves while sharing one husband. If a man is already married and desires to take an additional wife, so as to take away her reproach, it would be wise for him to discuss this very sensitive issue with his first wife and to get her agreement before he takes an additional wife. The final decision rests with the man, that's a fact, but getting his wife's buy-in would be a very honorable thing to do. Ecclesiasticus chapter 25 verse 1. Ecclesiasticus chapter 25 verse 1, it's also called Sirach in the Apocrypha. It says this: "In 3 things I was beautified, and stood up beautiful both before God and men. The unity of brethren, the love of neighbors, a man and a wife that agree together." There's nothing more beautiful than a man and a wife in agreement. If the man and his wife are both in agreement that they are righteous sisters who have no husband, and because of the condition that we are in, there is a need for righteous men to take up the responsibility to protect and provide for, if they're able to, another wife. That is a beautiful thing. Now, the question could be asked, if having multiple wives is not a sin, why do most Christians insist that it is? To answer that question, let's go back to the New World Encyclopedia. In the New World Encyclopedia, under the heading Polygyny, it says this: "Polygyny was practiced by most of the patriarchs such as Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and David, as recounted in the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, and was practiced throughout the time of the New Testament up until the 11th century. However, it was not accepted in ancient Greece or Rome and has never been accepted in mainstream Christianity." So now we're getting to the root of the problem. The Most High has no problem with a man having multiple wives. In fact, it could be a very righteous solution to many of the things that trouble us as a people. However, the Greeks and the Romans have a problem with it, have always had a problem with it. And in their religion, Christianity, they have taught the rest of the world that having multiple wives is a sin. The article also states the following: the political and economic dominance of Christianity from the 16th to the 20th century has meant that on the world scale, polygyny is legally recognized in very few nations. So because Christianity has destroyed and dominated the world, Christianity has destroyed the practice of polygyny. It's in those countries that are not Christian that the practice of polygyny continues to be legal. But when Christians get their hands on that, they enforce the Roman doctrines on those people and completely destroy that practice. Under the heading Polygamy and subheading Christianity, the New World Encyclopedia says this: St. Augustine saw a conflict with Old Testament polygamy and wrote about it in The Good of Marriage, chapter 15, paragraph 17, where he stated that though it was lawful among the ancient fathers, I'll read that again, it was lawful. That means it was not a sin. Even St. Augustine is saying this practice of polygyny, having multiple wives, was lawful, not a sin among the ancient fathers. It continues: whether it be lawful now also, I would not hastily pronounce. In other words, he's afraid to say it's still lawful because he lives in a Christian society and he knows better than to speak against what the Romans have put in place. In another place he wrote, now indeed in our time and in keeping with Roman custom, in keeping with Roman custom, it is no longer allowed to take another wife, so as to have more than one wife living. So St. Augustine realized that the Most High had no problem with a man having multiple wives. It was not a sin, it was not against the law, but the Romans had a problem. And the Romans, in keeping with their custom, outlawed the practice of polygyny. The same Romans who wrote the New Testament taught the Israelites and the rest of the world it's a sin to have multiple wives. And this is the reason that most Christians believe that having multiple wives is a sin. In conclusion, it is not a sin for a man to have multiple wives. Israelite men are free to have multiple wives today if we so desire. And this is part of our biblical heritage that was stolen from us by the Romans who wrote the abominable New Testament. Having said that, should we decide to have multiple wives, we must do so according to the scriptures. In other words, we must look after our wives in a way that is pleasing to the Most High God. And with that, I say shalom. And remember, if you find these teachings beneficial and would like to hear more, please like, share, and subscribe.